Hi everyone, my name is Megan Vogel and I'm presenting my research topic, which was the evolutionary process of courting behavior. So to introduce my topic, I'll introduce the idea of courting behavior itself. So courtship displays are just that. They're behaviors found designed to um, indicate attractiveness to the opposite sex in order to petition for mating. So they're most often found in males, and we'll talk more about why that is later. Um, and overall, the type of courting displays we're going to be focusing on are those that are physically taxing, time-consuming, or dangerous. Because as you see with a lot of these excessive courting behaviors, they're going to be physically taxing, and that they're going to require a lot of metabolic input and also a lot of energy in order to use. They're going to be time consuming, and they're going to take away time from other behaviors like searching for food, finding safety, and they're also going to be dangerous in the sense that, like I said before, you're going to be taking away from your time of safety, and also they become something that's going to make them more susceptible to predation because it makes them more brightly colored. So, what is the advantage? That is the question we're asking here. Like, why do these behaviors develop and persist if they stand so obviously opposed to what's most adaptive for the survival of these animals? So here we have a nice little video that gives a good example of a behavior that can be, as we talked about before, physically taxing, time consuming, and dangerous. This is a nice little mating dance. So as you can see, he's brightly colored. That makes him more susceptible to predation. You'll see here soon that this obviously takes a lot of energy and is time consuming as well. Pretty impressive, right? So our more defined question becomes, what evolutionary pressures and mechanisms drive the occurrence of complex and metabolically exhausting courtship behaviors? Here's another example of something that would be considered metabolically exhausting courtship behavior. You have your little fiddler crab in the right corner who's developed that large claw just for the purpose of being able to wave it and attract females. It's comparable to a lot of human mating strategies, like growing really, really big, excessive muscles. So it's helpful for this discussion to understand a brief history of the theory of sexual selection and where we get our perceptions of it today, how that's developed. So sexual selection was first introduced with the idea of natural selection in 1959. So in 1959, Darwin wrote On the Origin of Species, and the majority of that book focused on natural selection, or selection that is determined by pressures for survivability. Um, and so he compiles a lot of evidence and supporting arguments for natural selection. And he very, very briefly, in that book, about 3 pages, describes mate selection. He briefly alludes to female choice, but doesn't refer to it as that. And that book was published, and at the time, Darwin and Alfred Wallace were essentially just on the same page. Like, Alfred Wallace was a lot more personable figure. He was younger, more energetic. Darwin was sick and not very publicly personable. And so Wallace did a lot of the groundwork of really popularizing natural selection in the scientific community. So then in 1871, Darwin writes his second book, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. And in that book, he explores extensively the pressure of mate selection. He talks a lot about female choice, and he really goes into the process of sexual selection because he believed it to be incredibly important. At that point, Alfred Wallace pretty much continues to publicly promote natural selection, but refutes sexual selection, and he very much was against the descent of man. He believed that it sullied the simplicity and the logic of natural selection, and that natural selection was the more powerful and obvious factor at play, even going so far to say that female choice and that sexual selection was just anthropomorphism on the part of scientists. And so, because he was such a public and prominent spokesman for natural selection in general, his opinions gained a lot of traction, particularly after Darwin's death. And it's because of that that, with very few exceptions, sexual selection as a process was essentially ignored until the second half of the 20th century. One of those notable selections is in 1930, Ronald Fisher published the book, The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, in which he talks about how sexual selection plays a role in the characteristics and development of different species. And with that book, a lot of sexual selection as a theory began to gain traction again around the 1950s. So Darwin's ideas about sexual selection were essentially divided into three components, three types of competition between males. The first is general vigor, which is just a male's ability to exert more effort towards mating. Is he going to be more quick? Is he going to be more active in the mating process? Is he going to be able to maintain the energy to mate more times? It's your vigor. The second is fighting between males, your intersexual selection. And you have an example over here of these elephant seals that are fighting with each other. They're quite bloodied. Typical, very violent example of intersexual selection, usually with specialized weapons. And then finally you have, as he referred to it, a more peaceable display, or displaying to females. So ornamentation, songs, dance, gifts. A great example here is the bower bird, which is creating his very elaborate bower to woo females. So these three basic types of competition were all important to Darwin, and he saw most female choice going into the third. Essentially that, males are going to display and that females will choose. So consequences of this, or what you would expect to see in animals in which this is taking place, are a disproportionate sex ratio. So you would see that the more you have sexual selection happening, the more that species is going to diverge from that 1-to-1 sex ratio. You would see elaborate behavior and perception. In order for this to be possible, you would have to have elaborate behavioral abilities, going back to the bowerbird, like the ability to discern those colors and create those complex bowers, and also perception for the females to discern between that minute details that are important to them. And then finally, you would expect to see struggle increase proportionate to the increase in polygamy. And the elephant seals are a great example of this. They're known for their very, very large harems being controlled by one large male. And with that increase in polygamy, with one successful male getting to do the vast majority of the matings, you're going to see an increased struggle with very violent conflicts between males. So playing off of these ideas, Fisher in his book came up with the Fisherian runaway model. And the model essentially states this. It's a model for why you get these exaggerated features. This is a male widow bird here in this example, and they're famous for their exaggerated tails, which actually create a much more difficult situation for them to fly, but that females strongly prefer. So essentially the theory is this, that you essentially have a trait that's introduced, some sort of phenotypic trait that is advantageous. Like maybe a longer tail indicates better genes, or maybe a longer tail is good for distracting predators from offspring. There's a multitude of theories that could apply. But essentially, this trait starts out as an advantage. And so females, because it's an advantageous trait, become conditioned over time to select for that trait. And once that's in place, the trait can run away, essentially, that females will keep selecting for it, despite the fact that it's no longer advantageous. And so you get these traits that are extended past the point of being naturally advantageous. Another theory that could possibly account for these exaggerated features that we see is the good genes theory. And the good genes theory essentially says that the ability to display and produce impressive features is actually indicative of good genes. Now, initially, the peacock was regarded as the best example of the runaway hypothesis, that just was past the point of being naturally advantageous, that these huge tail feathers were just a runaway effect. And while that may be the case, what we've recently discovered is that there's actually a very strong correlation between having large tail feathers and not only having good nutritional resources, but also the ability to fight off diseases. That essentially you're not going to be able to allocate the resources necessary to make these tail feathers unless you have really good genes, really good on autoimmune response to parasites and diseases. And so when females select for this large tail feather size, they're not only selecting for that trait particularly, they're selecting for what it indicates, which is good genes and the ability to fight off disease. A final hypothesis that's kind of adjunct to the Fisherian runaway that was also introduced by Fisher is the sexy son hypothesis, which essentially says that it doesn't actually matter so much whether or not your offspring are more fit to their environment for survival, as long as they're more attractive. That having more attractive offspring is just as, if not more important than having many or healthy offspring. And that's essentially that when a female makes a selection for a male, even though it may be a promiscuous male that's dividing his time between nests, as we see in the case of this bird, it's still going to be more advantageous if she's producing male offspring that are more attractive. That attractiveness as a trait itself matters because you're going to produce offspring that are more likely to mate. So an idea that Darwin presented that generally seems to hold true is that in most cases, natural selection and sexual selection will work in conjunction with each other. In most cases, sexual selection is occurring in ways that are advantageous naturally, and that you're going to have female choice that leads towards the ability of that leads towards a greater adaptation for survivability as well. Now, occasionally, within runaway instances, you see that they can actually be in opposition to each other. So when this happens, you see a stabilizing effect. And now here we see the advantage of the widow bird again. There was a study done on this that showed that females with had a greater preference for tail lengths that were unnaturally exaggerated. So they would put fake tails on these birds that were really, really unrealistically large, and females strongly preferred those, and they would artificially shorten the tails of other birds, cutting off their tail feathers, and the females would not prefer those birds. And so because of that, you have survival advantage of a shorter tail feather working against female choice of longer tail feathers and a stabilizing selection, because those that the females would choose with the longest tail feathers won't survive. Their tails are too long, and those with the greatest survival advantage won't pass on their genes because none of the females will choose them. So here you see that the optimum tail length for survival there in red is the one that's the absolute longest, so going to be chosen by the most females that's still survivable, that they can still fly and escape predators. Finally, we have our purported circumstances that lead to sexual dimorphism and extreme courting behaviors. Like, under what circumstances are these things allowed to happen? Getting back to why you actually have this exaggerated features or sexual dimorphism, it's generally due to disproportionate parental investment. So when you have one sex that's going to be providing the vast majority of parental investments, most often the female, that sex's time becomes a scarce resource. They become a scarce resource because they're not available to mate as often as the other sex, because they're investing all their time in brooding young or raising young or some sort of parental investment. So because of that, the other sex is going to allocate more of their energy and their time to displaying, because when you have a higher investment, you're going to want to make a good choice. So because of that, it allows these secondary sexual characteristics to develop, and you see a large sexual dimorphism. So also, of course, I mentioned this earlier, if you're going to have extreme courting behaviors, you need to be able to have high perceptual and behavioral abilities. And finally, essentially for this extreme courting behavior to persist, you have to have relatively abundant resources and low predation to the point that you're not going to have that your scarcity of resources is not going to become so metabolically costly that you can't afford to have these courting behaviors, and that they're not so excessive that they're going to increase you to undue predation. So the wattled jacana is an interesting example because they are it's actually reversed. So in the wattled jacana, you have a role reversal where the males actually brood the chicks, and so the females will have the more pronounced sexual features, like these long spurs you see up at the top in the females that are longer on the right than in the males, and also the wattles. So on the bottom you can see a male on the left, he has a smaller wattle, and the female on the right has a much larger, more pronounced wattle. And this is because in this instance, the parental investment emphasis is placed on the with the males being the more scarce resource. So the females do the soliciting. And finally, these are my references. Thank you so much for listening.